Joining us today for the ISO 14001 2015 update webinar. So we've had this webinar in the past, but a lot of people are starting to get a little bit more anxious as they near their transition audits. So we like to hold this as frequently as possible to give everybody a chance to see what the new requirements really include for the new standard. What are some of the core changes from the 2004 version to the 2015 version? So hopefully this will set your mind at ease that it's really not that, the changes aren't that drastically different. There's a few key requirements that will require a little bit of work, but overall the changes aren't that significant. So my name is Scott Jones. I'm the EHS Program Manager at Perry Johnson Registrars. I manage our ISO 14001 program along with our OSAS 18001, soon to be ISO 45001, our R2, which is responsible recycling of e-waste, program our ISO 50001 for energy management, e-stewards, which is another e-waste standard, RIOS, which is your scrap recycling, and I also manage some of our greenhouse gas programs. So I am also lead auditor for ISO 14001 and all the other standards I mentioned. So if you have questions, whether from a technical standpoint or from a certification standpoint, you can definitely reach out to me at any time. I'll have my information up at the end of the presentation, so you can reach out with any technical questions or transition questions that you may have. So today we're going to do a quick intro of PJR, talk about some of the benefits and drivers to the new standard. We'll talk about some of the key update requirements or the transition requirements, key changes to the standard along with certification requirements, the transition, really time frames as to when you need a transition to the new standard, and then we'll end with probably 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please type them into the question panel on the panel screen to your right. I will hold off on answering the questions till the end of the presentation, but during that 10-15 minutes, we will spend that time going over those questions. So as you think of them, please type them in and we'll address them at the end. So PJR is one of the leading ISO 14001 registrars. We have offices throughout the world as well as auditors in almost every country throughout the world. So wherever you're located, we can definitely help get your company certified. Here's just a few of the places that we've certified companies to. We, as I mentioned, are accredited to a number of different standards. Here's a list of them. Obviously the ISO 14001, which we're discussing today, along with the OSAS 18001 and R2, which we see a lot of combination of those three standards. So if you have any need for these standards or questions on these standards, you can shoot me an email or give me a call after the presentation. So some of the benefits of getting certified to an environmental management system, obviously for the longest time, the quality standard ISO 9001 was one of the core customer requirements. One of the main reasons for a lot of companies getting certified. We're starting to see that same trend with ISO 14001 now. So not only are you potentially gaining additional business by getting ISO 14001, but really it's just a system that can help meet the needs of your legal requirements, making sure that you understand what your legal requirements are and making sure that you are in compliance with those requirements. Management commitment and employee engagement. Obviously, when you have a system like this in place, the responsibility doesn't just fall on one person, at least it shouldn't. It falls on the entire company. So employees feel more responsible and more engaged in the management system, which obviously boosts morale within the company. We have supplier environmental performance, making sure that not only your organization is environmentally improving, but also that the suppliers, anybody you work with, that's kind of being pushed on them as well. Provides competitive advantage. Obviously, like I said, most companies nowadays are, especially for a manufacturing company, are already ISO 9001 certified. So having an additional standard, to add to your belt will only improve the outlook or the look at your company to get that competitive advantage. And then providing financial benefit. especially if you're looking at energy objectives or anything like that. You can definitely gain a lot of cost savings from implementing new energy efficient technology to having an energy management system. You know, there is ISO 50001 out there, which is your energy management system, but a lot of companies build that energy aspect into their environmental system. So if you're establishing your baselines, you're identifying, you know, areas for improvement within that energy component. You can definitely see a lot of cost savings from reduced energy consumption to just having a maintenance program in place to help reduce any issues, any energy. You know, if you're looking at a compressor system, you're looking for leaks, you know, you can save a lot of money just by putting a maintenance program in place there. So you can definitely see a lot of financial benefit from implementing an ISO 14001 management system. So some of the 14001 drivers: commitment to environmental protection and conservation, reduction of risk of adverse environmental impact, and business management drivers include customer requirements and public image. So ISO 14001 2015 was released on September 15th, 2015. So there's a 3-year transition period for any company who is currently certified to the 2004 version. So once the standard was released on September 15th, you basically have 3 years to complete the transition process. That doesn't mean that you have to have your audit. You know, as long as you have your audit before that date, you're good. You need to have your audit and any findings, you know, everything closed out and done prior to that date. So that means by September 14th of 2018, you'll need to have fully completed your transition audit. So companies can continue to get certified to the 2004 version for 18 months. So if you're not certified to any, you know, version of the standard, you have 18 months from that September 15th date to continue to get certified to the 2004 version. You still, if you decide to do that, you decide to get certified to the 2004 version, you still have to transition to the 2015 version by September 14th of 2018. So after that 18-month period, all companies have to get certified to the 2015 version. So for the transition process, a client can transition at any time during this 3-year period. So the 2004 version is equivalent to the 2015 version during this time period. So typically, to save on costs, it's easiest to transition at your recertification audit, just because during a recertification audit, we're already going to be auditing all requirements of the standard. So there really isn't any additional time that's needed during that transition audit. But if you transition during a surveillance audit, whether it be a semi-annual or an annual surveillance audit, typically there will be a little additional time that may be added. It really depends on the number of employees that you have and how long that annual or semi-annual audit will be. But since your surveillance audits are only parcel system audits, we may have to add a little additional time to cover all of the transition requirements. That way we're recommending that all companies transition during that recertification audit. But obviously it's up to you and when you want to transition. If you have any questions on that, again, contact me and we can figure out if there would be any additional time required during that surveillance audit or not. We can figure out when your recertification is coming up and figure out if it makes sense to wait until your recertification or if you want to do it earlier. We can help guide you as best we can. So for all transition audits, you have until May 1st, 2018 to have your transition audit conducted. Again, that's because if we do it by May 1st, that gives us enough time to make sure that if any nonconformances are identified, whether it be minor nonconformances or major nonconformances, we have enough time. Not only do you have enough time to close them out, but then we have to review them, we have to approve them, we have to issue your certificate, and all that needs to be done prior to that September 14th, 2018 expiration date. So we want to make sure that there's no last minute struggles to get your transition audit in. You know, a lot of people will be waiting till the last minute, so we don't want anybody to have a certificate expire because they weren't able to get their audit done in time. So why is the standard being revised? Excuse me. Largely market relevance, compatibility. You know, as ISO 9001 changed, ISO 14001 changed to be in line with the new changes to ISO 9001, and really, eventually, all ISO standards will follow the same framework that we'll see here in a minute that the new standard has. Ease of use. There's fewer prescriptive requirements. The intent is to make it to have a management system that is easily established and implemented for any organization. You know, the previous standard, it was pretty easy for most companies to get certified, but this one makes it even easier as far as what documentation you need. You know, really what's applicable to your organization. And it's really up to your organization to determine that and determine how it should be established and how your management system should be implemented. So easily understood. So making sure that anybody in any country and anywhere in the world can understand the requirements of the standard, can establish them and implement them. Making sure that for free trade, that it should not permit the free trade of goods and services, applicability of conformity, and then exclusions. So for exclusions, there are obviously certain, depending on what your organization does, there are certain requirements that, you know, truly may not be applicable. So it allows for those requirements to be excluded. Obviously, that'll have to be indicated in your scope. It'll be indicated on your certificate of what requirements of the standard are not applicable to your organization. So here we have Annex SL. This is the new structure for the standard. So you'll see on the left-hand side, there's 10 bullet points. Those are the 10 chapters of the standard, starting with the scope of the standard, the normative references, terms and definitions. And then really once we get to the context of the organization, that's when the core requirements of the standard begin. So that's Chapter 4. So from Chapter 4 to Chapter 10 are really the core requirements of the standard. So as you see, it's changed quite a bit. Really, it's just different terminology of the heading, and they've reorganized some of the requirements within these chapters. But for the most part, a lot of the requirements haven't changed that much, as you'll see when you go through the standard. But you have context of the organization, you get into leadership, planning, support, operation, performance, evaluation, and then improvement. So along with the Annex SL, you have some common terms. So these terms are really applicable for your ISO 9001, your ISO 14001. These are the core terms that are going to be applicable to all ISO standards. So the new 2015 version also follows the PDCA model. As you'll see, the model is slightly different, but it still has that planning, the support and operation, performance evaluation, and then improvement. What you'll see that's a little bit different is as far as inputs, you have your internal and external issues. So there's a much larger emphasis in this new standard on the external issues especially, which we'll get into, and then the needs and expectations of interested parties. As you'll see in the middle of this, though, is really one of the main changes. That's the leadership. They're placing a large emphasis on getting away from the idea of a management representative and putting that on leadership as a whole. So we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. So here are some of the key changes in the new standard. Like I said, you have emphasis on leadership. You have focus on risk management. We'll get into the risks and opportunities. And typically we just had your environmental aspect, but that's been broadened and expanded into risks and opportunities. Emphasis on objectives, measurement, and change. Communication and awareness, and then fewer prescriptive requirements. So here we have some additional changes. So it gets into strategic environmental management. It's basically saying that your environmental management system should be built into your business processes. So how you manage your organization from a business standpoint should include those environmental components, from procurement to shipping and receiving, just to your general manufacturing. How are you improving the environment throughout your business? Then again, here in leadership, it talks about, to ensure the success of your management system, making sure that specific responsibilities are given to the leadership and given to top management, who are responsible for the processes or the different activities and areas within the organization. Protecting the environment. So there's no specific, really specific definition around this, but it's all encompassing. So you want to make sure that throughout the management system that you're ensuring the prevention of pollution, sustainable resource use, climate change mitigation and adaptation, protection of biodiversity and ecosystems. So if you're adding on to your facility, you're going to add on, a new warehouse to your facility. Obviously, during the construction of that warehouse, you need to make sure that the biodiversity and ecosystem of that area is being protected, and that doesn't impact the biodiversity and ecosystem throughout the surrounding area. Environmental performance. So now the new standard doesn't just require you to improve your management system. That's kind of what the emphasis was always on. Continual improvement of your management system. When we're talking about environmental performance, it really should be improving the environment. So the new standard requires you to show continual improvement of your environmental performance, making sure that you are in fact showing through objective evidence, real data that continual improvement of the environmental performance is being obtained. And part of that can be done through this life cycle thinking. So depending on what your organization does, some or all of this may apply. So a life cycle thinking is, if you're manufacturing a product, you're going to start from cradle to grave. What is going into that product? How are you purchasing that product? Are they environmentally friendly components or products or chemicals or raw materials that are going into this product? Can you change the raw materials to make it more environmentally friendly? To how is that raw material being shipped to you? How are you manufacturing that? What processes do you have on site? What equipment are you using on site? To how is that product being shipped? How is that product being used or consumed? And then what's the disposition of that product? Is it being disposed of in landfills? Is it being recycled? So you should think from cradle to grave, what impact your product or your service has on the environment, and identify opportunities for improvement. Communication. So the development of communication strategies with equal emphasis on external and internal communication has been added. The previous version of the standard always had an emphasis on the internal communication, and you could choose if you wanted to communicate externally on certain issues. Now the standard is saying on all external and internal issues, you need to communicate properly. Documentation, they've gotten away from saying you need to have a written procedure for internal audits, for management review, for whatever it may be. Now you need to have documented information. Really the intent is to kind of get with the times and identify areas where you may not need a written procedure. You may be able to do it electronically. You may have a database or a software program that really is your procedure and kind of controls how a certain process is done. So that's kind of a significant change. Now we don't necessarily expect everybody to just throw away their manual and their procedures. A lot of it is still applicable. A lot of companies will still use it. I don't think that's really the intent. It just opens it up for different options if you didn't want to have a written or documented procedure. Okay, so this gets in now to the specific requirements within the standard. right now we're not going through a kind of a line-by-line overview to see the changes. We're just doing a more higher level kind of changes of the standard by chapter. We'll have another webinar in the near future that'll go over the more specific changes within each chapter. But for now, this is just to give you a higher level of what's changed and kind of what are the expectations of the new standard. So the context of the organization is just basically just making sure that you understand how your management system is going to be established, what needs to be included within your management system, what are your internal and external issues that will be part of your environmental management system, who are your interested parties, what is your scope going to be, what is your policy going to look like. So that's really being addressed through the context of the organization. Then Chapter 5 gets into leadership. So again, it's making sure that the responsibilities of the management system are not falling on one person necessarily. As you see in the last bullet point, it talks about that the management representative is no longer explicitly requested. So do we anticipate that a management representative will still be there? Absolutely. Typically, you're still going to want somebody to kind of bring it all together and kind of oversee some of the due dates for certain requirements. But the intent here is to make sure that top management leadership as a whole is responsible and aware of their tasks and their requirements to ensure an effective management system. So they understand the legal requirements that are associated with their process or activity, that they communicate that to their employees so that they understand if what they're doing can impact the compliance of that legal requirement or can impact their objectives and targets. So the top management needs to be much more involved. So as an auditor, as we come into the facility, we're going to want to interview top management to make sure that they do, in fact, understand their requirements, that they understand the impact that their process or activities can have on the environmental management system. Then we get into environmental policy, so making sure that their commitment to protect the environment goes beyond the corporate boundaries, and that top management is aware of the environmental policy and they understand the potential impact of their activities. So here we get into the planning process. So those first chapters 4 and 5 really are just kind of the foundation of the management system. Now once we have set that foundation, we can get into planning how we're going to establish the management system. So the entire planning process in environmental management has been restructured and should take into consideration the positive and negative. So typically when we thought about environmental aspects, we thought about the negative impact that it can have on the environment. So we want to identify what are the positive and the negative potential impacts, because you can have a positive environmental impact. So products and services, taking into account more strongly the life cycle perspective. And then we'll get into risks and opportunities. So again, depending on what your organization does, you may or may not have to conduct a full life cycle assessment, but every organization will have to conduct at least a portion of that life cycle assessment. And really, it just depends on what you have control over. So here we get into 6.1.1, which addresses those risks and opportunities. So the risks are really things that you can't really get rid of. They're going to have a negative impact on the environment. You can put controls in place to help mitigate and reduce those risks, but you can't really change them. Then you have opportunities. These are really areas where you can improve the environmental management system by potentially using environmentally friendly chemicals that are not hazardous. So you're getting away, you're basically eliminating an environmental aspect or a risk. So the risks and opportunities need to take into account your environmental aspects, your compliance obligations, and then any other issues and requirements that are identified in 4.1 and 4.2. Again, 4.1 and 4.2 really just addresses those internal and external issues. So then we get into environmental objectives. So the environmental objectives shall take into account the organization's significant environmental aspects and associated compliance obligations. So every organization is going to have significant environmental aspects. Obviously, what may be significant for one organization won't be significant for another. But every organization needs to identify what is significant to them. So your environmental objectives should revolve around those significant environmental aspects. So you need to consider, when establishing your environmental objectives, what are the risks and opportunities that are associated, especially with those significant environmental aspects. I mean, the idea is to identify what the biggest issues are, what the biggest environmental aspects are, or the biggest risks are, and to control those by setting up environmental objectives. And this will lead into ensuring that you are showing continual improvement of your environmental management system. Chapter 7 gets into the support. So the commitments to environmental protection are to be given more consideration in terms of communication. Again, there's a much larger emphasis on that external communication. So making sure that you're reporting everything appropriately, especially when it comes to legal requirements. And then again, it gets into the documented information. Again, don't read too much into the documented information. Nothing's really changed from what you had before. It just gives you more options and more flexibility on how, what procedures you have or what forms you have, because a lot of it you can do electronically now. For operation, you want to pay a much closer attention to the upstream and downstream. So it's not just what's happening at your facility. The operational controls shouldn't just be on-site. The operation controls can include, for example, procurement. How are you obtaining your material? How are you shipping that material? How is it being used? So all of that should be into the operational controls. So in 8.1, it talks about that life cycle perspective. So you should be looking at the design and development process, the procurement, any external providers or contractors, potential significant environmental impacts associated with the transportation or delivery. So all of this needs to be included now in that operational planning and control requirement. So in Chapter 9, there's really not a lot that's changed here. This is just the performance evaluation, making sure that you are reviewing your environmental objectives, that you have data to back it up, that you're monitoring and measuring your environmental management system, that you're conducting your compliance evaluations, your internal audits, your management reviews. So all that is included into that performance evaluation. So it may look a little bit different, but you'll see that overall there's not a lot of significant changes. So Chapter 10 here, improvement. This is, as I mentioned before, this is one of the new requirements. So it's not, again, continual improvement of your management system. It's showing continual improvement of your environmental performance. So one of the probably easiest ways to demonstrate that is through your objectives and targets. Setting objectives and targets around those significant aspects and showing improvement on those objectives will then result in continual improvement of your environmental performance. So again, that really hasn't changed because you've always had objectives and targets, and you've always had to show continual improvement of those objectives and targets, which in essence showed continual improvement in your environmental performance. So the wording's different. It's explicitly stated now, but I don't really think that the requirement has changed that much. But from a certification standpoint, that's one thing that, in order to continue certification, that we need to review and verify that you are in fact continually improving that management system. That's now a requirement for certification. Guidance references. So that covered the requirements of the standard, chapters 4 through 10. In the back of the standard, you have Annex A and Annex B. Annex A provides a guidance for the different requirements of the standard. It will break down clause by clause and kind of give you guidance on what the expectations are. And then Annex B is just a correspondence between the new version, 2015 version, and the old 2004 version to show you the differences and where previous requirements align with the new standard. So it shows the correlation between the clause numbers. and then bibliography, basically where they obtain a lot of this information. So that's kind of the standard in a nutshell. Obviously, go through the standard, read through the standard. I'm sure you'll have questions. Obviously, we can't consult, but I can definitely help clarify some of the requirements within the standard. So certification steps, if you're not familiar with certification, or if you're certified but you're new to your organization, new to the management system processes, really the steps for certification are: one, to establish your documentation, or the documented information. Establish your management system to ensure that you're meeting the requirements of ISO 14001. The next thing you're going to do is make sure that you train your employees to the requirements, to your documentation, your procedures, so they understand, their responsibilities within the management system. So once you have your management system in place, your employees are trained, and then you can implement the management system. So after you've implemented it for a little while, typically at least 3 months, then you can conduct an internal audit to see how effective the management system is. You can conduct a compliance evaluation to make sure that the controls you put in place are adequate in helping you to meet the compliance and the regulatory requirements. So once you've done all of that, then you conduct basically your management review to ensure that you've gone over your management system, you know where the gaps are, you know what you need to improve, and then you can feed that back into that planning process of the management system to continually improve your management system. So once you've done all that, you can contract with a certification body, and honestly, you can contract with a certification body at any point during that process. You can do it before you've established your management system, or anywhere in between. But once you've implemented it, once you've reviewed it, you're ready to go with a certification body, we'll come in and we'll complete a stage 1 and stage 2 audit. So stage 1 basically is a documentation review. We're going to come in and make sure that you're ready to go, that you have the proper procedures and documents and forms, and you have everything in place that you need to. It's basically to make sure you're prepared for the stage 2. So at the stage 2, when we come in, we're going to basically make sure that everything that we looked at stage 1 is being implemented properly. So that's really the purpose of the stage 2. So any nonconformities that come out of that will need to be addressed. There's minor nonconformances and major nonconformances. Your minor nonconformances are just minor gaps, minor breakdowns in the system. A major nonconformance would be something that you missed just completely. So for major nonconformances, we'll need to see objective evidence of the corrective action that you've resolved the issue. And then once we verify closure of those nonconformances, then you're good to go and we can issue that certificate. So that certificate's good for 3 years. In between those 3 years, you'll have surveillance audits. So following your initial certification audit, if you're doing annual surveillance audit, you'll have 2 annual surveillance audits, which are partial system audits. We'll make sure that, basically you're maintaining your system. We'll audit specific areas of your management system, kind of the core requirements that we always look at, some of the main processing components, areas of that had previous issues, and then we'll continue the certification until that, after those 2 surveillance audits, then we'll do a recertification audit. That's a full system audit, and we'll make sure that at that full system audit that your management system as a whole, we'll go through every requirement, is effective. And then pending the outcome of that, if all is good, then we'll issue another certificate for 3 years. So that's the typical certification process if you're not familiar with it, and that's really the same process for ISO 14001 and any of the other ISO standards. So this kind of just goes over what I just said. Typically between the stage 1 and stage 2, you have 30 to 45 days in between to make sure that any issues that were identified at the stage 1 are addressed prior to the stage 2. So here again, you have your surveillance audits and recertification audits. So that's really it. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in. We'll have, looks like we've got plenty of time to go over some questions. again, if you can't think of any right now, if you think of them later, feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call, and I'll be happy to get on the phone with you, and we can walk through any issues that you may have. But again, this isn't meant to be, a detailed overview of the standard. This is just kind of a higher level. We'll have a more detailed overview of the specific requirements and some of the changes within each chapter in the near future. All right, one question we have here. For service providers, can paper use be the basis for certification and objectives? For service providers, it's really up to you to identify, what your objectives are going to be and what your certification is going to be. If your largest environmental aspect is paper consumption, if I'm reading this right, or involves paper, then that's up to you to identify that and determine that and put objectives around that. Your scope of your management system and on your certificate will it'll include what processes you actually do. So if you're a paper manufacturer or whatever your operations or processes are, that's what's going to be on your scope. But it's up to you to identify that and determine that. Will this PowerPoint be available for attendees? Absolutely. All of our webinars get posted to our website, so you can download the presentation, and you can also download the slides of the presentation, or you can download the actual webinar that was given today. So it may take a day or two to get up on the website, but check back on our website, and it will be up there. If you can't find it, shoot me an email, and I can help you get it. Yeah, going back to the previous question, if you're looking at if it's for a distribution facility, then again, it's hard for me to say without knowing what all is being done at the facility and what their aspects look like and their risks and opportunities look like. But I wouldn't see an issue with it. But again, I'd probably have to have a little more detail on what exactly is at the facility, what environmental aspects are included, and how they identify their significant environmental aspects. Next question, how many objectives are auditors looking for? Can the objectives be in line with the ISO 9001 performance data? There's really no set requirement on how many objectives an auditor is looking for. The standard doesn't say you have to have 3 objectives or you have to have 4 objectives. It's really up to the organization. Can they be in line with ISO 9001 performance data? Potentially, depending on what the ISO 9001 performance data is geared towards. If it's obviously for the environmental objectives, it has to be geared towards their environmental risks and opportunities and environmental aspects and such. So, but it can definitely be geared, I'm sure it can be somehow in line with some of the 9001 objectives and performance data requirements. But typically, initial certification, we're going to want to see that your core processes, your core environmental aspects around those processes have objectives in place. So that's really, it'll look different for every organization. Unfortunately, I can't give a better answer than that. But we want to see that your processes, your core processes that you've identified, if you have significant aspects associated with those core processes, that you have the objectives to go with those. So to find the 14001 2015 standard, you can go to the ISO website. I believe it's iso.org, and then you can go there and purchase it. We do not have the standard. We can't provide the standard, but you can get it on the ISO website. Next question, while a management rep is no longer dedicated in the standard is pushing for leadership as main thing. Can an environmental liaison be assigned? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't foresee, especially as auditors, when we go on site, typically we're still going to be meeting with one person who's kind of being the liaison for the management system, or may still be considered the management rep. I don't really foresee that going away. But as auditors, when we go in there, we're not going to want to just be sitting with a management representative the whole time. We're going to want to talk to top management and leadership to make sure that each manager, or each person in the top management is aware of the requirements, is aware of their responsibilities. So I absolutely foresee one person or maybe a couple people being the liaisons or the management reps moving forward. But again, that's up to every organization. Since it's not specifically required, they can do whatever works best for them. But typically, you'll see someone who's kind of pulling it all together still. Next question here. Can we obtain a PDF of the standards so we can determine what would be involved in an initial certification? Yeah, again, unfortunately, PGR cannot provide it. You have to go to the ISO website to purchase that. But yeah, I think you can buy, I think they have like a kind of a condensed version that's free, potentially. But it's not the full standard, but it kind of goes over some of the core changes. But you're going to want to get the full version of the standard. So unfortunately, you have to go through them and buy that. In ISO 14001 and 14001, what is the design involved? Really, if you have design within your company, that goes back to that life cycle process. When you're designing a product or developing and designing the product, what's going into that product? How are you designing it? Are you designing it with an environmental mindset? That's what the standard wants to see, and that's what auditors will be looking for. Obviously, not in every case can you include environmental for everything, but they want to at least know that it's being considered. Whether you look at it from a cost perspective and decide that it's just not feasible, but where possible and where appropriate, that you implement environmentally friendly, or you're environmentally cautious, I guess, when designing products. All right, are there any other questions before we get out of here? Again, here's my information. Again, my name is Scott Jones. You can contact myself or Austin Matthews, who's the EHS Assistant Program Manager. Either one of us would be happy to help you. So again, I know this wasn't, we didn't go into detail on a lot of the specific requirements, so as you're going through the standard, if you have questions, transition questions, certification questions, again, you can contact me anytime. Email is usually the best way, since I travel a little bit, so I can usually get back to people a lot quicker if you email me, but I will usually get back to you that day or the next day. So again, look forward to the upcoming webinars that will have more specific, we'll go into more specifics on the requirements of the standard. We'll do probably one half of the standard and then the second half of the standard at a later date, but it'll go into much greater detail. One more question here. Are the external providers to be certified? They don't have to be. If you have external providers, contractors, or you're outsourcing something, they don't have to necessarily be certified. You just need to make sure that you communicate your management system requirements. So if they're providing something to you, especially if they're coming on site, you need to make sure that they're aware of your environmental policy, your environmental issues, and your environmental management system, and what you expect. In an ideal world, yeah, everybody could get certified, but that's just not realistic. So making sure that they are at least aware of your expectations from the standpoint of your environmental management system is sufficient. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, I'll hold on for another minute. But if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully, it was informative, and hopefully, it will set your mind at ease that it won't be as difficult to transition as many people expect. It's always the fear of the unknown, but I think as we get into this, you'll see that the changes aren't that drastic, and a lot of them you're already doing, and you don't even realize it. So hopefully that's the case, and I'm sure you'll have questions as you go. So please don't hesitate to email or call me. Well, it looks like that's it for the questions. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.